Ordered it. That's good too. All right, folks. My name is Adam. Most of you all know me. This is going to be sandcasting. All right. So, who's cast anything before? FDJtool.
I cast with you. I cast a year and a half ago.
Nobody's cast anything? All right. Well, there's a couple different ways that you can cast objects into metal. Probably the most famous and the best way to do it as far as jewelry goes is what's called lost wax casting. Just had a little piece of that stuff around here somewhere. But you basically take what's called jeweler's wax, you carve it into a shape, whatever you want, and then you put it into a mold, you burn the mold out, all the wax melts out, and then you pour. This is jeweler's wax, just a big solid block of it. Comes in every imaginable shape you can imagine. But yeah, so if you were to make a big giant brick of metal, you would then put this into a mold. You would fill it up with jeweler's investment, which is a really high temperature, almost like a plaster of Paris. And then you put this into an oven, bake at 1500 degrees for 10 hours. All of this would run out, and then you would have a perfect block-shaped hole inside the jeweler's investment. You pour the metal in, and voila. Okay, so why are we not doing that today? Well, basically, it's a very long and involved process. Like I said, it takes about 10 hours just to clear the mold out, and it takes a couple $1,000s worth of equipment to get that done. So, we need a cheaper option. Now, you will also hear about things like cuttlefish bone casting, where you would take a piece of cuttlefish bone. If you've ever had a bird at any point in your life and you wondered what that little weird oval white thing that you hung on the side of the cage was, that is a bone from a squid. Go figure. But it makes an excellent casting material. So you go in and carve that by hand into whatever shape you wanted, and then you would pour the metal in, and if all went right, you would get a metal thing shaped like what you carved. Now, it self-destructs after the first use, and you may have spent a week carving the cuttlefish bone, and if it doesn't work right or your hand shakes and you miss the mold, and then it's gone, and you're angry and starting another hobby. So, enter sandcasting. Sandcasting does not do, it is not what you'd use for fine detail, okay? It has its limitations, and I'll go over those, but it's cheap, it's easy to do. If you mess it up, your turnaround time's about 15 minutes, so, you know, you can try over and over and over again until you get it right. Like I said, it's cheap. And we'll go over what it's not particularly good at. All right. Let's talk about the metals real quick. I recommend silver. Silver is by far my favorite metal to use. It is not too pricey, but it also flows very, very nicely. I can always get the best detail out of silver. It stays liquid a little bit longer than most of the others. Even brass, which is my second choice, tends to cool down a lot faster than the silver does. And it just behaves. Now, I've never tried it with gold. I can't afford gold. If I ever reach that point, I'll let you know what I think. But, and if you're curious, that is a good indication of how much detail you can get. Actually, you can even do, let's see.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Okay, good. Oh, yeah.
Very good. All right, and that was the original. So,
Oh, that was your name?
mm-hmm. It's not perfect, but it's not bad.
It does the job.
What kind of class?
We were doing sand casting today. So, molten metal and fire. Agrees to most people. So, what's the limitation? Well, we are going to be using, this is our sand casting mold. And the way this works, here's your sand. I'll discuss the sand here in just a second. You fill up the bottom, put the object in. This is full to the halfway point. Put the object in. You put the object up to its halfway point most of the time. And then you put the top on, pack in more sand, make sure that the sand is well packed, tight, and won't crumble as soon as you take the lid off. And then you take the top off, you remove the object, and you cut some holes for the metal to go in, put it back together, melt, pour, done. Okay? So, I'm going to do an 8-sided dice. All right, simple geometric shape. Not going to go too crazy. It's kind of nice when you succeed in front of people. So I'm going to keep it fairly simple. Now, with this shape, I like it because, remember, you have to pull this back out of the sand. So if the shape has an undercut of any type, when you pull the item out, you will upset the sand and ruin your mold. Now, you can orient objects in a lot of different ways, and the more you work with this technique, the more you'll understand what you can get away with and how you can kind of fudge it. Sometimes if you've got an item that's held back by one little detail, it's easiest to just go ahead and cast it with the flaw in place, and then you can go back and carve the detail back in with a flex shaft or however you prefer to do it. So let's talk about the sand real quick. Now we carry two different kinds. This is the ProCraft sand, and then there's Delft sand as well, but I think we're out of that, are we not? Yeah, we've been selling a lot of that.
Yeah, that one we saw.
All right. Now, I really recommend the Delft. It's twice the cost of the ProCraft, and I don't work off commission, so there's no conflict of interest here. It holds together better than the ProCraft does. The grains are finer, and the binding agent that they use to keep the sand together seems to work a little bit better. It's not a huge difference, but it's enough that if I had my choice, it's worth it for the extra money, because especially the holding together part. When I get done with the mold, I don't want any part of it crumbling and falling back in, and then I have to fix it. Yeah.
How much would like that size cost versus the other kind?
22, I think.
And then so like 44.
Yeah,
okay.
somewhere around that.
Okay.
Now, what this does. Now, if you're careful, you can hold it. You can see even lines from my palm in the sand. So it holds very nice detail. And the Delft does as well. But that's its job. I mean, you're going to put anything in here, and even with what I consider, and don't get me wrong, the ProCraft is fun. I can still get the numbers off of this dice
With that one?
with this one. Now with the Delft, it comes out very, very nice and crisp and clear. And don't worry, this is nothing dangerous or anything. And this stuff is reusable. When you get done with your mold and you pull the item out, everything that has been in contact, direct contact with the metal, will be charred. That has to get thrown away, but everything else gets punched out and thrown back in. And this doesn't, I wouldn't leave the top off, but it doesn't seem to ever dry out. All right, we're gonna have mold parting powder, borax, a crucible, and call me crazy, but some nice fireproof surface would probably be a good idea. Fire extinguisher on hand, ready to go. Make sure you know where it is. Okay. Yeah. You don't want to do a public surface announcement or anything. All right. All right. For you, you don't need them just yet. But okay. We're going to go over how to cure the crucible here in a second. I'm trying to think of anything else. I didn't finish telling you about the metals. I told you silver's great. Brass is my second choice. Brass flows very nicely. It's very, very inexpensive. I usually go for the wire if I'm going to buy it. This is a very cheap, easy way to get a hold of brass. And then you just roll it up into little, we'll call them billets, although that's not really what it is. But scrap, this is actually brass, but the coppers come up to the surface, so it looks like a hunk of copper. And then if you have any sort of scrap, just cut it up into the smallest pieces available. You can put it in chunks, but the bigger and heavier the chunk is, the longer it takes to melt down. So, you know, save yourself some time. Stay away from copper. It does work to some extent, but copper takes a lot of heat to melt. You're upwards of 1700 degrees to melt that, and it flows like mud. Not super thick, but it is thick enough that it will cause you problems, and copper sheds heat like crazy. So it will cool down to the point of being unmanageable almost before it even hits the mold. So it can be done if you have an extremely simple shape, cylinder, sphere, stuff like that. It's difficult, but it can work. You have to get the metal very, very hot in order to get it to flow into the mold correctly. But more often, what it will do is by the time it leaves the pour spout, hits the mold, it solidifies, and it does not fill the mold at all. I've tried cutting it with brass. Honestly, it just turns the copper into a pinkish, brashish, something very similar to that. And really, if you're going to do this, just use brass. So, all right, let's set up a mold. Oh, the other beauty of this is if you mess it up, I mean, if anything goes wrong, your pour goes wrong, it doesn't come out the way you want, it takes about, without having to explain to folks, it takes about 15 minutes to set up a mold. So your turnaround time, you can do this all afternoon, you can get about 50, 60 tries in, one of them's bound to come out right.
So I say.
But honestly, if you're all here, you probably share my viewpoint that there are very few things in the world more fun than melting a bunch of metal. Honestly, love of fire is probably 90% of what leads people.
Depends on what point in fabrication I'm in. It's for everybody.
True.
True.
Oh, you haven't lived till you've melted something you've spent 2 weeks on.
Oh, baby. Oh, yes, I have many times.
It's usually on the final step, too.
Oh, that's even worse.
All right, so we're going to pack this in as tightly as we can. You get it in as tightly as you can by hand.
And I was gonna say, you don't have a special tool for that?
Uh,
That's it, right there.
Honestly, I recommend the nylon hammer a little bit more just because it's easier to clean up, but rawhide works just as well. Avoid using any sort of metal hammer. These molds, they're aluminum, and if you were to hit the ring around the mold with anything other than one of these guys or a nylon, it would bend it out of place. And they're pretty tightly fabricated, so there's not a lot of play in that. And if you were to dent it, it would cause problems. So, all right, take the special implement. There we go. Okay, you want a nice smooth surface, thusly. So, and you're going to take your object and you want to orient it in such a way that the metal can flow in easily and there's not going to be open the door. Hey, how's it going? Okay, now if you've got your mold and your object is, say, something like this. Now, this is a fairly convoluted shape, and there is all sorts of opportunities for air to get trapped inside. So, if the item's in there and it's got an odd shape, all right, if you were to put the pour spout here and you poured the metal in, then think of a glass upside down in water. Okay? If there's going to be air trapped inside of it, the metal can't flow in, and then you're going to have big voids in your mold. All right? So, anyone want to take a stab at what we should do?
Flip it over.
Yeah, a couple holes.
True, but what if it was shaped just as strangely on the other side?
And you're going to have more than one pour hole.
You're on the right track. We're only going to have one pour hole, but what we will have are vents.
Okay.
So,
Force the air out.
right. Anywhere that there's a high point, other than where the metal's coming in, the air needs some place to go. And it doesn't need to be much. Just a very minor hole, and I usually do them around the perimeter, so it's as far from the pour spout as possible. Okay? So, anybody want to take a stab at how you would orient G.I. Joe here?
Straight ahead.
Would you come from here or here?
You say the bulk of them's here, so maybe here and bent there. Oh.
What about that way and straight out of this rear end?
There you go. Perfect.
And then it would just flow right in.
Yeah, right.
All right. So,
So do you want to aim for it to be as shallow as possible as you can get it sorted in a way, or no?
you take all the little rules and you apply them and you try the best you can. And if it doesn't work, then you turn it around and try it another way. Any object you look at, you think, okay, where would air get trapped?
Because you can just keep reheating the metal over and over again, so you're not
Absolutely.
wasting.
So in this, if you were to have a pour spout here, then this little ridge down here, that point on his helmet, and honestly, that would be about it. I'd do probably 2 or 3 vents here and 1 vent at the helmet, and then 1 on each end just to make sure that the metal flowed in probably here and here, just to make sure that there was no resistance at all as the metal flowed in. because the metal stays liquid only for a very, very short time. So you want it to move as fast as possible, get into position, and then let it be. All right.
How do you know where the vent hole is going to be if it's covered with sand?
I'm glad you asked this. Okay. Straight to the midpoint. Make sure that we don't have the sand covering up anything that would cause us problems later on. And you'll see a little notch right there in the front. It lines up with this notch. And that keeps you from spinning the mold or putting the top back on incorrectly. All right. Now, if I were to put this on and pack the second half of the mold with sand, something unwanted is going to happen. Anyone want to take a stab at it?
It's gonna stick together.
Yep. If you were to pack sand into that right now and hammer it into place, then there would be no border between the bottom half and the top half. So we need to put some sort of barrier between the two of them. Enter mold parting powder. All right. I don't know exactly what this is. I suspect it's talcum powder. You're not going to get them to admit to it, but it's not pricey. Now, the best way to apply this is to put it into a men's dress sock and then just lightly tap it on top of the mold. And I keep forgetting to bring one. I'm honestly not sure I have one of those anyway. But take a brush and make sure that there is a nice even coating of it. This does not need to be in the danger zone there. Maybe you, Joe.
That's fine enough. It won't make a mill imprint on the...
No. No, you'll never know it was there. Unless you leave clumps. Avoid clumps if they are. We're good. First showing, I promptly wiped my hands on my shirt, which was hilarious. Try to avoid that this time around. All right, let's line up my marks. There we go. Place the sand in. And this is, all things considered, a pretty gentle process. I've had very good luck putting very fragile items in here. And they make it through being hammered in sand pretty well. I mean, they get a little dirty, but all right.
Don't put a hand-blown glass octopus in there.
Honestly, it probably
Would it take it?
yeah. I've put a lot of shells, some really thin stuff in here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's done great. I even put some ammonites and fossils and yeah, everything came through with fine colors. All right, and the more you pack the sand, the better your mold will hold together. So don't skimp.
Okay, question.
Sure.
Take your army man when you put him in there. You had to use your mark that you've got on the outside there as a reference point as to which way he's facing and where the air holes need to be drilled and all that stuff, right?
You're not using anything on the outside of the mold as an indicator. Remember, we have to take the item back out. So, very carefully. take that apart.
Bingo. Okay.
And then, now, this part, go lightly.
Getting it out of there.
Well, getting it out is not particularly hard, but you want to be very careful. See, there's a little bit of an overhang.
What are you doing? You're just pushing that with the.
You don't want to disrupt the edges so it doesn't.
This got, the edge got slightly buried under the sand. So if I were to just pull it out of there, the edge of the mold would crumble.
Yeah.
Just a tiny bit right there, crumbled and fell. Make sure that it is not actually in the mold, but I think it's good enough. All right, so we need to, I'm going to go ahead and do the main air hole first, or the main pour spout. What I'm going to use for that is a drill bit. Now, the reason I don't use just a straight steel rod or anything like that, if you push down, it will shove the sand to the side and it will distort the mold, and that will cause things to crumble. If you put in something pointed, it will do the same thing. The point will slide in, shove the sand to the side. The best way to is actually remove the sand from the channel. So, and you don't need much force. Matter of fact, you don't really want to use any force. You're just spinning the drill bit very gently.
Let it do its job.
And it's right through. This can sometimes be a little challenging because I've got the pour spout, but you see a little bit of the sand. Oh, sorry.
Like built up around it.
Correct.
Around the bottom.
Yeah, it collects, and it's very loose. But since the sand is made to stick to itself, it needs a little encouragement sometimes to get back out of there. And just light pressure from a hobby knife. A little burst of air and a fine paintbrush will usually do the job. If you mess it up too bad, you can put some of it back into place, or you can start the mold over, or deal with the consequences and then carve it back out of metal later. Which, depending on how badly it's mangled.
Can I ask a question? So before I took the class, I looked at YouTube yesterday, the day before, and somebody had something like this, but instead of drilling the hole where you can pour, they had actually cut a piece out of the side of these molds, so you could just pour it in there.
Oh, like a built-in funnel?
Correct, but they cut it like from that. They just cut a little piece, like a little square, and that would be. And then so when you put the piece, you just make a little.
It's
Can you
really
do that?
6 half dozen. It's you can do this. You know, I know what you mean, but honestly, this is not what I'd consider to be really that difficult. And maybe their method works a little bit better. Maybe I should watch it and see what they're up to. Tell you what, I'll show you the rest of this and see what you think. Okay, so now I need to make a funnel. The funnel, you don't want to cut down into the mold, so you take a look at how deep you can go. I've got about ½ an inch of clearance. You want it to be relatively straight-sided, but you want to keep it fairly large at the same time because you are going to be pouring molten metal into this and you don't want to miss.
carry the anti-toner squares that you can put in a showcase, or in the case itself.
Let's go a little bit deeper.
But I don't really have that.
And this stuff is just to give yourself some leeway when you're pouring.
Yeah, this is literally going to serve as a funnel. You want it to have as steep a side as you can, just so you can get the metal down into the mold chamber as quickly as possible. And my hands are starting to shake again.
So when you drill a bit smaller than that, it just won't flow through. Kind of puddle up on you. Can.
You can get a little.
You wouldn't go tiny, but that. Yeah.
Yeah, the shell, wherever it is. That one, yeah, it's got a. That's about as small as we've gone.
Okay.
Which is pretty good.
Well, they're about the same size as these.
Let's see, can I fix this real quick? Yeah. A little rough, but well, we'll go with it. Okay, now, even this shape with one vent hole is still going to have problems with trapped air. So if the metal came in through the top, you've got a sealed chamber and the air has nowhere to go. So I'm going to cut 4 channels, hobby knife straight up and down,
You don't want to clean them any more than absolutely necessary.
one from each corner.
Okay.
So you're not going very deep at all.
Nope,
Just a
these do
scratch.
not need to be large.
Okay.
Shallow.
Well, you're going to make 2 cuts, one straight down and one at an angle. So you're going to make a little triangle-shaped trough. So now this one comes along.
Oh, okay.
But they're still kind of shallow, right? No.
Yeah, size is not really an issue with the air channels.
No matter what you clean
This
them
is
in,
long
you
as
have to
they
be
have
careful
a
because.
place where you can
Yeah.
escape.
And metal doesn't go into it.
Sometimes, but not normally.
What stops it? Does it just want to stick to itself and not go down like in a larger way or something?
Well,
kind of thing?
If it goes down those, it's no big deal.
Okay.
You're going to have to cut off like this is what's called a sprue button,
Okay.
and you're going to have to cut that off anyway.
Okay.
So a couple extra small ones isn't real.
Okay, I got me a clipboard. That's laying over here. My top counter. Anything that, like in cases or whether it's the singles up, you want it right down.
Hear you sighing, Rick. We're almost to the exciting part, I promise.
Oh, no, I'm excited. Listen, I'm enjoying this. It's air conditioned.
That is very true. Is everybody good? Does anybody need a phone charge or anything like that? Okay, good. I have an Apple charger over there. I don't think we have anything else. Okay, so you saw the drill bit that I used for the first one. This is going to be the one that I use for the air holes. Much, much smaller. And I'm going to go around to each one. I'm not really going to worry about twisting it this time. Snake it through.
So all the way up to
Through those channels that you did.
Yep, right through the end of them.
So regardless of the shape of the figure that you're casting, they're all like, for example, using that little like plastic army guy that we laid down like on his front side, kind of, they would still come out like that way, like you were talking about.
Either with the arming guy, I would literally do the holes straight from the point. So you can do them radiated around, but it's really dependent upon the shape of what you're doing.
Okay.
This one, it's a very simple geometric shape, so I just
So
decided.
you're saying you would carve this way along that whole thing?
No, I would just do a whole, like, if I were to do the mold. So this is your halfway point, his rear end's the high point, and then I would take this out, and then through the very top of this portion of the mold, I would run this straight through the top.
Okay.
Just straight up like that.
Okay.
That would be the pouring section for this one, for the,
I would pour from a channel cut right there.
okay.
That's the highest point, and it's also probably the most central point of the mass.
Okay.
So all his mass is centered right around here, and the highest point's there, so I'm definitely going to go for it. And then that way the metal can flow, it's equidistant to every other part of it, with the exception of maybe the ends of the
So you
figure.
always make the hole at the highest point of the design?
I hate to say always, but for the most part, yeah. All right. Let's see what happens. Okay, marks are lined up. Army guy is out of the way.
You only do it on one, not on the other one.
Yes, if you try to use this as the top, it fits into the mold with a little lip. If you pack this side with sand first, then it fills up the lip, and you're going to have a hard time putting the halves together. And honestly, today is probably the first day I've ever done this demo without accidentally doing that for both shows. So trust me, you're going to do it, and then you'll have to stop what you're doing and either dig it out or fix the whole mold.
But I don't have to do the channels on the bottom one, just on this one?
Just on the top one.
Okay,
The air doesn't, yeah,
that's right.
it's not going to go out to the bottom. I guess you could if you really wanted to, but I've never really thought about that.
Okay.
So if it works for you, let me know. All right. Now, torch, I'm going to be using propane and oxygen today. A 2-gas torch is definitely going to be the way to go. If you have access to acetylene oxygen, that works very, very well. MAP and oxygen works great. Propane and oxygen didn't give me any trouble this morning. Now, for single gas torches, a straight acetylene and atmospheric air would probably work. MAP gas only would work, and propane I think would work, but you'd have to give it a lot of time to melt everything down. So, we're going to talk next about why I have borax. Okay. Borax is what we use to line the crucible. You'll see that this is glassy. It's stained red from, I do believe that was copper that was in there. So that glossy area, that is the melted borax. Think of that like a non-stick coating for a pan. If you were to put melted metal straight into a crucible, it's a very porous, well, pretty porous surface, and the metal sticks to it and they become one forever. You then have to chip the metal out of it. And that's the only time you'll get to use that crucible. So what we're going to do first is we're going to add a little bit more, because it seems like almost every time you do this, a little bit runs down the side, and you lose some of it, and it exposes some of the crucible. You need to coat that again. So, stuff in the right order. If you put the borax in first and then apply the flame, the borax goes everywhere. All right, it gets airborne, and you look like a snow globe, and it makes quite a mess. I found that if you heat the crucible up to a nice dull red glow and then put the borax in, it tends to pre-melt and stick to it, so that when you apply the flame, it's not so bad. It's still not the cleanest of operations. And this is, you'll see,
I love that tip. Watch this thing work. I love this.
this is a Gentech little torch. Smith little torches are also almost the exact same thing. This is normally the tip that you'd find on one of these torches. A lot of people only assume that these torches are good for small, very delicate work. They have available what's called a rosebud or melting tip. These are good for melting 3 to 5 ounces of metal, and they will put out a huge flame. They're also, if you prefer to make very large, very heavy jewelry, this is a very good way to solder large pieces all at once.
I gotta get one of those. I saw it work last time we did those here.
Okay. Blast shield's in place.
With that little Smith, that'll work the same.
Okay. Get this nice and hot. And you'll see this start to look wet, I guess, for lack of a better term. You'll see it start to get really glossy. And borax, once it starts to melt, especially at the beginning, moves very slowly. It moves like it moves like honey, basically. But the hotter it gets, the more freely it flows. So we'll get this nice and hot, and then I'm going to add some fresh stuff. If you stop for any reason, point the torch straight up in the air. Okay? Unless you have a really low ceiling, then don't follow that advice. Okay? Don't dive straight into it. Heat it up. Allow it to melt. And keep these little things to a minimum. Alright. Now, we want to, kind of like you're buttering a pan, you want to roll the bead of borax around. It's not quite ready to move. And try not to get your torch tip too close. There's plenty of flame there. Let the flame do the work. If you get the torch tip too close to the actual crucible, there's like backwash heat, and you can do damage to your rosebud tip. Okay, let's see if it's willing to do what we want. Still a little thick. Sorry, guys. You can see where it's almost wet.
Okay.
And I'm only going to be working on the bottom half of this, so I don't need the whole thing to be glazed. I want to make sure that there's some on the pour spout and that there's some on the bottom. Because I'm going to be working on the bottom, and then I'm going to move towards that half. I'll put in that large chunk. That's really hot. A couple chunks.
You can mix metal.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's actually kind of fun to try to come up with your own alloys.
Okay.
Take notes if you do that. So if you ever get something good, you can recreate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Go around the outside edge. Try to draw in all the pieces that are on the periphery and get them into the middle. That's the best way to melt stuff. So, like this piece, spend some time, get that to melt, draw it in towards the rest of the metal. Try to keep your pieces small so that they melt nice and uniformly. Big hunks like that giant glob that I threw in there are a real pain to get to move. Now, put a little bit more of the flux on top, This is going to provide a barrier between the oxygen in the air and your metal. See how that one piece turned pitch black? It's because it forms oxides. Oxides are basically when the hot metal interacts with oxygen in the air, and it makes crud. Let's get that going. Okay, you'll see me work the whole perimeter of the metal, and we're going to get it into a solid bead. And then as it gets closer to being done, we'll move it over to the left-hand side next to the pour spout. We've got to heat up both the metal and the pour spout, because if it goes over a cold lip as it's going into the mold, it will lose a lot of heat on the way over.
So when you get that melted, is the brass like honey, or is it more liquid than that?
It's more liquid than that.
Well, cool.
Yeah, I know. It's my favorite part.
So the problem here is the copper, that's taking longer.
No, I didn't put any copper in.
Oh, which one was that one, the big chunk?
That was brass too.
Oh, okay.
It was just from this morning, and I'd already melted it once. So all the copper that was in the brass came to the surface.
Okay.
If you start by melting the smaller pieces first, when they make contact with the larger piece, it seems like it helps spread the melt. I'm not sure that makes sense, but show you what I mean. It tends to hang in to the last second, and then it kind of all goes at once. That whole left side's pretty liquid. Now, I'm going to be working with my right hand to my left if you guys want to come around the other side.
Do you care if we take a few pictures?
No, go right ahead.
Almost use penny stays on this.
Should we be worrying about any of the fumes?
Nah, it's a little bit of melted borax. I mean, yeah, it keeps some ventilation. Breathing smoke of any type isn't really good.
Surgeon General.
Yeah, but you know, try to do it outside.
Okay, but it's not crazy caustic.
No.
Okay.
Okay, what we're looking for is you can see the metal start to spin on the surface. And once you get it to the point where it's spinning very, very rapidly, and you can see it's very, very liquid at this point, we're ready to go. Now, I'm going to apply a little bit of heat to the pour spout, go back to the metal. Pour spout, back to the metal. Okay, then spend a little bit of time because you need that metal to be as close as possible. And we are going to go in one quick action. So make sure you're ready.
Very cool.
And be patient.
Honestly, woo! The metal is actually cool. Now, the brass on the inside, not so much. But
It's that fast that you can start messing with it.
Yep. Right here.
I was gonna say, can you dump it on the loader?
Well, I don't want to ruin all that the clay.
That's right.
So.
I'm thinking after you solder, you dump it.
We're getting there.
Do you need a super pickle to clean all of the oxides off from the casting?
Honestly, wait do you see what it comes out like? Remember, this has not been exposed to air while it was in its molten
Makes
state
sense.
very much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it comes out in pretty good shape.
I can't believe you can touch
I
that.
know.
Well, the water got it.
Water.
I'll
Oh
admit
my
my
gosh.
hands are kind of leather
Ah,
Okay.
after.
but you're gonna give it to me anyway.
Welcome to FDJ.
Hey, you get your own
First
brand.
time.
What
There
number
you
did
go.
your brander in?
Very funny. Very funny.
Sorry.
Very funny.
I could not resist.
Nope, that's totally alright. I understand.
Oh, it
That
actually
was
did
very
get the
cool.
numbers in there.
It's not hot at all.
I know, but it looks like it is.
Thank
Is
you
it
for that.
still red?
Yeah, that one came out nice and crisp.
Oh, I see. I gotta go ahead and pass it back. I see it. I like it.
Yeah, touch it, man. Come on.
But it does look like it's still hot.
Yeah. Just your brain messing with you.
I know. Honestly, if you've been doing jewelry for a while, the most common thing, by far, I don't know about everybody else, but I do it to myself at least once a month, that you'll get so wrapped up in what you're doing and you're working on something and you're soldering and you pull the torch up and you go, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. 30 years of doing this and I still do that to myself from time to time. But yeah, and then you can just lop. It's a little pinched up here. I think that the mold may have been slightly messed up, but you would then cut it off up here and then just grind that into shape, and then voila, you have a brass 8-sided die, or a pendant, or something to wire wrap, or whatever it is that you want to do with it. It's cool.
That's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a
Watch
silly
that.
question,
Yeah,
but kind of
still
how
have to
would
do
you
it.
turn that into a pen? So after you carve the side off, like
Do you solder?
So, not since I was in like high school making stained glass windows.
You can probably
But
get a
that's
jump
another
ring,
skill.
solder a
Yeah,
jump
yeah,
ring
solder
out
You
of
would
it.
just
Yeah.
solder something
Yeah.
onto the top of it. Okay.
I would just use like hard silver
Gotcha.
solder, make a little bale,
Okay.
and whatever suits your taste,
Yeah.
and then
But
yeah.
solder. Okay. Cool.
You could also drill it.
Yeah. If it's solder, yeah, that makes
I
sense.
would think that would be so hard.
Sure.
No, that's cool.
Well, and it's tough too on that angle to get you drilled just
Mhm.
straight through, because it's wanting to slide.
Machinist vise,
Yeah,
horizontal
okay,
vise.
yeah.
Okay.
Like a helper.
Those things are worth their weight in gold. They've got little vertical channel. I think some of those over there have it. It's been a while since I checked, but they'll grip an odd-shaped object like this, and then just grabs it and then keeps it horizontal. So you could drill at any angle, and so long as you countersink
You got to count, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. But you could countersink it, and then that will keep it stable while you drill through it. No problem. Any questions?
What's the crucible made out of?
Really
Something that
heat-resistant
doesn't
stuff.
Space shuttle.
Yeah.
Heat shield from the space.
Silica,
Sounds good.
ceramic. Other than that, I don't really know the specifics.
They make it look so easy. I'm gonna go home and probably screw it up really bad.
You've done it before.
With you, but
Yeah,
not by
but-
myself.
Look, there's no I did it wrong, I did it right. You mess it up, you had fun,
I
you
was
melted some stuff, you turn around and you try it again.
I was trying to figure out how are you going, because that's what scares me is. So I'm more like.
So you have a torch like that? How, like that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I do metalsmith.
Okay.
But I was thinking, how do I handle the torch, that pouring it out, and putting that? I guess it's not that
Well, okay.
complicated. I just have
This
to
is-
do it.
Let's pretend that this is the pour spout. Okay? So I have got the metal to where I want it. And I've got it in the crucible.
Hold the crucible in your dominant hand. Huh?
My right hand. I guess so, because when you go to pour it, if I do it on this hand, that's not my dominant. It'll probably be because
Are
what
you
are
holding
you?
it in your dominant hand?
I'm kind of
Yeah,
Both ways?
yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. Whatever feels comfortable. Picture it in your head before you do it.
Are you left-handed?
I am
So
left-handed.
that's why you were using the torch. Yeah, because I'm thinking if I try to do the torch on this hand, I'm not going to do a good job. But I can hold
Yeah,
the
you could just
crucible.
as easily turn this around
Yeah.
and work from it this way, and then you work with the torch. But
See, I'd have to do it that way. I'm right-handed, and I would have to do it that way because I would have more control of the crucible. Okay.
Yeah.
With your right hand.
With my right hand.
I
Yeah,
use
I'm
my right
right-handed.
hand for like strength movements, finesse with the left
Yeah,
hand.
I don't know.
Really?
Right hand for work and pretty much almost anything. But
Yeah,
writing
because
in
the
on-
more I'm thinking about it, to pour it
So,
in.
now,
This is yeah.
if you saw me, I would heat the metal up. I got it right about there. Made sure that this portion was very, very hot. And then I moved it into place till it butted up against the edge of the mold. I put the pour spout right over there. And so all I have to do is use this as a fulcrum and pour.
Do that again. Hold on.
Okay?
Okay, there we go.
So you make sure your metal, you start with it flat, and you work with the metal, you get it to the point where it's starting to melt. And then I tip it up, and I get the metal to move down to this portion of the crucible. That way I'm using this little portion of the crucible. It holds the heat slightly better than the flat portion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And then once I've got the metal completely balled up and moving like mercury, then I get to here, and then I'm heating up the pour spout, and I've got it resting against the edge of the mold,
Okay.
and then I've got the pour spout in place over the hole that I'm going to pour it into, and then once it's ready and the pour spout's hot, then you just tip.
You never keep the torch on the sand. It's always inside of the ceramic.
The sand temperature doesn't matter.
Okay.
This method does not require a hot mold. Now, if you were doing lost wax, the mold has to be very hot. But this, it's going in cold, doesn't matter. Matter of fact, the sand does not really enjoy direct contact with the flame.
Okay.
So can you let it cool completely before you take it out of the sand?
Sure. I'm just impatient. So I don't normally have it burst into flames like it did, but
That
curious
scared me
about
for a
that.
second.
Yeah.
I was like, he's gonna lose a hand, and I'm gonna have to look at it.
Yep. Remember,
How much?
fire
Right, that's right. How much is a tool like that, to like the fire or whatever? And can you?
the torch?
Yeah, like is that something that you can like? Would a space around here have them like for rent to use, or is that what?
You can take classes.
Uh-huh.
If you want a complete 2-gas setup with the refillable bottles, you're looking low end, probably mid 300.
It's not the worst I've ever heard.
Yeah. I can work with you. We can probably do something a little bit less. It's been a while since I priced one out, but let me know if you're ever interested.
Gotcha.
What I recommend is if you're on a budget, go with the refillable oxygen bottle. Disposable oxygen comes in a little canister, red. They're very nice. You can use the disposable regulators on top of them. They have almost no oxygen in them, and they run out after about 30 to 40 minutes, and they cost $9 a piece.
Oh, sure, you're getting way ahead of me. Don't even worry about it.
Okay. What I do recommend is disposable regulator for the fuel. One of these will last you a month, 2, 3 months. And you can also buy what's called MAP gas in the same place you would get propane. MAP gas boosts up the heat, and it's very clean. I've gone to that exclusively. I like it a lot.
I use oxygen acetylene. Is it any different than what you just used here?
It is considerably hotter.
Mine or
Yes.
yours?
Oxygen acetylene is, other than like hydrogen and oxygen, like the hottest flame that you
So
could.
mine will probably be even much better in heating it up
Mhm.
then. Okay.
From experience, I would say that the acetylene oxygen, this tank is an acetylene. I'm just out of it right now.
Okay.
But the acetylene will melt that quantity of brass in about a minute.
Much
Yeah,
quicker than
but
what it took you.
It's dirtier though.
It is dirty.
Mine.
Yeah,
Yep.
you're gonna have a lot of soot, so don't do it like in your living room.
Yeah.
Do it in a somewhere because you'll start to get black.
I've kind of noticed that because every time I turn it out to do my jewelry, the minute you turn it out, that black comes out in little pieces. And
Yep.
black are everywhere.
Acetylene is the worst as far as dirt, and it will cause some soot buildup around your studio. MAP is much cleaner, but it still will produce a little bit of soot. Propane is the cleanest.
So then I would
I've
have
never
to
used hydrogen, so I don't know what that's like, but I'd
So then I
imagine
would
that's
have
pretty
to
clean.
switch to acetylene for propane.
Oh, pardon?
So I have acetylene and oxygen. What is it that's causing the soot? Is it the acetylene?
The fuel, the acetylene.
Oh, okay. So what are you using right now?
Propane.
We
Just
use propane.
plain propane?
We use propane oxygen.
Yeah.
Okay, and yes, together. We
Okay.
have, yeah,
Two
together.
tanks. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
And it's clean. I mean, we have our studio in our house.
Yeah, that's
It's one
what
of the
I
old
use a room.
bedrooms.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I don't have any
With-
problem with
This
it
is
whatsoever.
straight propane right here. It's actually a fairly clean flame. You can see a little bit of smoke up here, but if this were acetylene, it would be
black.
thick, oily, black smoke coming off the top
That's
of it.
what happens to me every
Right.
time.
I try
Okay.
to get the oxygen involved so that it turns to a blue flame when I'm working with acetylene as fast as possible, so that reduces the amount of soot.
That explains so much that I did not know.
But with the acetylene, you also get that huge advantage of having it produces much more heat.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you can melt faster when you're
solder faster.
because when you're like soldering silver and things like that, silver, copper, all that stuff, it sucks the heat up. So when you're having to heat the entire thing, it just absorbs the heat, absorbs the heat.
Yep.
But when you've got acetylene, you can get that stuff up to temperature very
Yeah.
quickly.
Acetylene is preferable.
Mhm.
Okay, I don't want to completely warn you off of it.
The only problem is the soot. That's it.
Well, the cleanliness.
Here's the problem with acetylene: cleanliness, and you have to go to a air gas or a place to get it.
That's where I get it.
Okay, it's not something that you can buy readily.
Correct.
I do most of my work in the middle of the night. I work till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and if I run out, it's usually going to be at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I choose propane because A, it's clean and I work in my house. B, if I run out of this, I run down to Walmart and pick up another one.
Mm.
Now, I do have acetylene and I really enjoy using it. But this has a lot of
But I
advantages.
mean, I just see things so much clearer now for a year and a half. This is, like, I can see now why things sometimes go wrong and why things get done quicker.
You will be doing that for the rest of your jewelry career.
Well, you know, and I see other metalsmiths doing what you just did, and I don't see that black. I'm like, why do I always get the black? I'm probably not doing the mix right, and that's what it is.
Well, that tip right there will help offset for some of
Correct.
the loss with the acetylene, won't it? I mean, doesn't it? But that puts out a lot of heat right there.
A lot of heat. I mean, you can get that tip for acetylene as well, and
But
a
if you
picture
go to
that
propane,
flame, except the flames 800 degrees hotter or 1,000 degrees
Yeah,
hotter.
I mean, it's
I'll
considerably
probably
hotter.
burn something then.
No, you just basically do what I did. You just do it in half the time.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
I learned
So how do you clean the sand to save part of it?
Okay. When you're done with the sand, anything that's charred and black goes in the trash.
Or the cat box.
I don't know how your
You can
cats would
try.
feel about that, but so now this is in good
Listen,
shape.
that's a
A
very
little bit of
good
black is
idea.
not going to be a problem. All of this needs to go. The problem is that once it's charred, it no longer sticks, and if you keep mixing it back into the sand, then the ratio of charred sand to good sand starts to fluctuate, and the sand does not hold together like it should. So once you're done with this,
And so that powder that's on there isn't enough to affect your being able to squish it together again?
not unless you just go hog wild and put a ton of it on there, then yeah, it would. Any other questions? Did you have fun?
Very interesting.
All right. If you perchance want any of this, there's the ProCraft kits. That has one of everything you need. There's the Delft clay molds. ProCraft has a much larger mold that you'll see in use on YouTube quite a bit. I kind of like the little molds. Yeah, we've got crucibles in various sizes. If you're only going to do little tiny stuff, then just use a little tiny crucible. If you try to do little tiny stuff with a big crucible, it just takes a little while to build up the heat and something like that.
What is that just called a torch? Like, what are names that I would look for?
This is a 2-gas torch.
2-gas torch.
Yeah. You have basically a
I'm just
torch.
about to start seeing if anyone I know has one, and I'll just.
Sure. You have your fuel line, so you decide what type of fuel you're going to use, and then you add oxygen to it, which is the green or the blue line, depending on what type of torch you have. And it's the adding of the oxygen that boosts the temperature. Now, you always have to have oxygen coming from somewhere, so you'll have some torches that use atmospheric air, but it's not pure oxygen, so it's kind of a diluted effect. So if you go to Lowe's or use one of our single gas torches, they suck in air from around and then mix it with the fuel. So you can get torches that only use acetylene, and they get quite hot. Not as much as the pure oxygen, but they do quite nicely.
Torch.
Torch them, yeah. Put the crucible on them.
Oh,
Torch it.
Yeah.
He'll wind up burning the whole place down, chasing it.
who has chopsticks?
All right, you go behind him. Oh, you! Oh man, I thought you had him.
I had him twice. All right. Okay, folks,
All right, thank you.
have fun.
What type of brass is this? It looked like bronze, but is it like jeweler's brass? I know there's different.
It's red brass. Yeah, most of what we get.